we're on day 4 now of the prisoner hostages exchange between Hamas and Israel. Also, day 4 of a ceasefire. There's been about 160 UN trucks, this is according to the Red Crescent, that have reached northern Gaza in terms of aid. It appears as if the ceasefire is going to be extended for a couple of days. Unclear under what terms. I know earlier Israel was floating the idea of 10 hostages released per a day of ceasefire. So it becomes, if you think about it, really hard. Not even that hard. It becomes really bizarre in some way, because while Hamas is holding hostages and unclear, the totality of the prisoners who are being released by Israel, Israel will detain people. So it's not necessarily anybody who's been convicted of anything by Israel. Israel has also reportedly threatened these released prisoners from talking to the press, et cetera, et cetera. Remember, these people get released and they're still under control, essentially, of Israel because they're going to return to occupied territories. We don't know much about them.
Although the list that was initially given of like 300 or so, and then 150 they whittled it down to, many of those were teenagers arrested for small things like throwing rocks at tanks.
Right. And like I say, we know broad strokes. We don't have the sort of the individuated stories that we hear about the Israelis. But at the same time, the idea that like the ceasefire, if you really start to look at it, well, if you start to look at it, the pause, but the idea that they are going to extend it for, Hamas to do something. If you look at this from afar, it looks like that in many respects, the Israelis are holding the entire population, the civilian population of Gaza hostage. And the idea is, nice country you have there, but if you don't want those people bombed more, release our hostages. I mean, it is, it really is in many respects a hall of mirrors. But all that said, here is a clip of Chris Murphy, and this is where we're headed. Joe Biden is anachronistic in a lot of things, and perhaps maybe most anachronistic when it comes to his Israel policy. There is, I don't think we're going to see another Democratic president again who is going to show this much deference to the Israeli government. And I would just say this. We know this deal has been on the table for weeks and weeks. I have no doubt that Joe Biden was heavily involved in the diplomacy for this. But it also is quite clear that this is not something that started 6 weeks ago. And we also know that in no time has the U.S. government, at least there's been no reporting to the effect that we're going to condition our aid upon you doing this. And the Biden administration seems to think that, like, well, had we not been as compliant with Israel's wishes, then we wouldn't have this leverage. But that idea, I think Chris Murphy is starting to indicate that, like, we don't necessarily buy that. There's laws of physics and power that exist. Here's Chris Murphy talking about the idea of like conditioning aid.
We regularly condition our aid to allies based upon compliance with U.S. law and international law. And so I think it's very consistent with the ways in which we have dispensed aid, especially during wartime, to allies, for us to talk about making sure that the aid we give Ukraine or the aid we give Israel is used in accordance with human rights laws. And that'll be a conversation we will all be engaged in when we get back to Washington on Monday.
Well, President Biden said that he thinks it's an okay idea, but he also worries it could hinder diplomatic efforts to condition the aid, because you are going to have to deal with this. This is something that is going to be on your plate to vote on quite soon.
Yeah, obviously this will be a conversation we have when we return. I guess I'm not sure what would be controversial about simply saying that aid we give any country has to be used in compliance with international law. And, yes, of course, I do think that Israel needs to be more careful in the way that it is conducting these operations. I think that you can defeat Hamas without this level of civilian casualty. And so that's an appropriate discussion for us to have, in part because I really don't know that it serves Israel's strategic aims in the long run if Hamas ultimately is given this kind of bulletin board recruiting material.
Yeah, it seems a little late for the bulletin board recruiting material, but basically what's going on here is Joe Biden, like I say, anachronistic policy towards Israel, thinks that you can go back to read Peter Beinart's piece back in 2020 before he was elected president in terms of Biden's sort of past deference to Israel and its administration.
And his many donations that he received from pro-Israel, one of the top recipients in the Senate and as a presidential candidate from pro-Israel groups.
I mean, regardless of what ultimately motivates it, but yes.
Sure, what comes first, chicken or the egg?
Exactly. But nevertheless, what Murphy's doing here is basically setting the groundwork for if there's going to be Israeli aid, it's going to be conditioned. And that allows Biden to go back and say, look, well, my Congress won't do it without conditioning. And of course, then, Netanyahu gets on the phone to AIPAC and says, metaphorically, of course, I'm sure they have no contact because AIPAC's not registered. These are the people that we need to go after and threaten with, dropping $10 million in outside expenditures. But nevertheless, this is where things are headed. Biden can pay lip service to, that's good, but this would hurt negotiations. In many respects, it probably wouldn't.
Yeah, that's a question. Is like when she says it would hinder diplomacy, it's like, I think maybe if we took a more even hand approach to the Israel-Palestine, it would actually help diplomacy.
It's
what would hurt is
diplomacy.
like local lobbying, like you say in our.
Well, the argument that Biden would have you believe is that if we're not super nice to the Israelis, they're not going to do what we ask them to do if we ask them nicely.
Are we being super nice?
As opposed to the idea of like, hey, it's going to be hard for me to get authorization for X, Y, and Z, Iron Dome, whatever it is, unless you guys start acting like within international, rules.
Yeah, not rogue.
And here's the other point. Murphy says, it's not controversial, and he's saying that because he wants to be able to promote these type of conditions. But it is highly controversial because we know. I mean, it's simply unequivocal. You can say that I don't believe in the UN or I don't believe in international law, or it's just because of X, Y, or Z that they've passed this. But the occupation is illegal. The 700,000 settlers who didn't just sort of pop up there through some type of teleportation, that's illegal. There is a strong argument, aside from moral considerations, because obviously from a moral standpoint, I think most people can agree that the killing of civilians is morally reprehensible. But if you want to look at international law and what people living under occupation can do under the terms of international warfare, it's pretty broad. And so, but the point being that it would be controversial to condition these things on international law, but I think it still may happen. We'll see. I hope if any of it gets passed, because it's going to set a standard in which future administrations hopefully will be able to assess Israeli behavior without having to sort of make it a political issue. It's nice to be able to defer to some type of rules-based system.